Welcome, everyone. My name is Alberto Saleo. I'm the chair of the Material Science Department at Stanford. And on behalf of the department, I want to extend to you a warm welcome to an event that's been long in the making, the inaugural Nix Lecture. So I told you who I am, and you are actually a combination of former students, current students, former faculty, current faculty, staff, and then friends of the department, so people that have been associated with our department for a while, one way or another. And I'm really thrilled to see so many people. We're expecting pretty much a full room. We have about 300 people registered, so this is going to be a really good morning. And I'm really excited about the program. So the program says that I'm going to speak for 15 minutes, but I won't. I don't have 15 minutes worth of things to say, and I'm really excited to move forward with our program. But I wanted to give you an idea of the genesis of how this event started. Many of you remember, because you were here, that 3 years ago we celebrated the 100 years of our department in 2019. And it was exactly in this room. It was a similar crowd of former students, current students, faculty, and so on. And it was really a great event. Everyone was happy to reconnect, either connect for the first time or reconnect, share stories, chat about their time here. And I had two key takeaways from that day. The first one was that most people didn't want to wait another 100 years to get together and hang out again. So that was number one. And number two, it was amazing to see how the fraction of people that were somehow connected to Bill. Bill has had over 80 students in his career, dispersed between academia and industry. He has also many informal mentees who got advice from Bill over the years and cherished his advice. A lot of people took classes from Bill. I have to say, when I started here, Bill was still teaching. As an assistant professor, it was a little bit intimidating that every quarter that Bill taught, he was the only one who got 5 out of 5 in the student surveys, and so that was the bar that you felt you had to reach as an assistant professor. It was a little tough. I can tell you, I started with 3.5 out of 5, which at Stanford means 7th percentile from the bottom, right? So, as I say, it's good. When you have room to grow, they say it's always good, right? And so I think the conclusion from those two takeaways was pretty obvious. One and one makes two. We should have an event that repeats on a regular basis to get all our wonderful material science community together. And we should celebrate Bill's achievement as a member of our department and as a material scientist. And so that's how the idea of the Nix Lectures came about. So that was 2019. We're in 2022. I'm sure you imagine the delay was due to the global pandemic that hit us. But here we are, and we're really happy to be able to be all here in person. We toyed with the idea of having a remote event, but that just didn't feel right. People just like to be together in the same room and reconnect at a personal level. So now is a good time to thank our provost, Persis Drell, who supported this event with her discretionary funds. It turns out it's a good thing when the provost is a member of your department. Since the provost holds the purse, it's nice when she can loosen the purse strings a little bit to benefit her own department. And so here we are. Thank you, Persis, for allowing this to happen. So for the centennial, Bill also wrote a book about the history of the department, and you'll find a few copies there. It's really a wonderful book. You can find it on Amazon as well. It has great stories, pictures, and it paints the history of our department from really the beginning. I guess Theodore Hoover was a member of the department, or the ancestor of our department. We can claim Herbert Hoover as well, since he translated De Agricola, which is sort of, to some extent, a metallurgy book. And then goes through the whole history of the department over the years, all the way to 2019. And if you read the book, you'll see that our department at some point was down to only 8 faculty. And at that time, the Dean of Engineering thought that it might be a good idea to make the department part of a division of the Department of Electrical Engineering. And of course, Bill would have none of it. First of all, he was chair at the time, and he thought that, first of all, that would hurt the School of Engineering as a whole, because all our peer institutions in the School of Engineering always have a material science department. And it might not be the largest department, often it's on the smaller size, but it's really fundamental to the School of Engineering, because material science is at the heart of all the other engineering disciplines. It's not only, at the time, maybe because of the development of Silicon Valley, one could think that a lot of material science really should be part of semiconductor development. But it's much broader than that, and Bill, of course, knew that, and so it should be its own department and allowed to grow. And so the legend goes that Bill convinced the dean with arguments that you can ask him are often found on a football field and not in the rarefied halls of academia. But he was successful, and the dean that followed actually was a big supporter of our department, and thanks to Bill's advocacy and the chairs that followed, we were allowed to grow. And we're now at about 18 FTEs, and if you count faculty that are shared with other departments, we're about 21 faculty in material science and engineering. So that's broadened our department quite a bit, and with that development, and I'm part of that expansion, we've strengthened our traditional areas of expertise, semiconductors, mechanical properties, magnetics, but we also developed completely new areas of material science, soft matter, polymers, for example, but also biological matter, interaction with the brain, 2D materials, atomically thin materials, characterization of materials using X-ray lasers. And so our discipline has become really quite broader since, and so Bill was right. Materials engineering is really at the heart of all the other engineering disciplines. And in fact, I think that we're currently sort of in a golden age of material science. On one hand, we have now reached the ability to control materials at the atomic level, but also look at materials at the atomic level, so we can really make the general idea that you can engineer a material by controlling its structure and its defects through its synthesis so that it performs the function it needs to perform with atomic precision. We really are now at that level. But also, if I think of the last maybe 10 years, there's been this explosion of artificial intelligence and machine learning. But now we're at the realization that, in the end, everything goes back to materials. And in particular, a lot of the challenges that we're facing nowadays, they will need new materials to be solved. To begin with, actually, if you want to make all these wonderful algorithms run and not melt the planet with the energy dissipation that they will involve, you will need ways to do computation much more efficiently in terms of power, and that will require new device architecture and new electronic materials. In terms of sustainability and the climate challenge, you will need new materials to transform energy from renewable sources and be able to utilize it, whether it's solar cells or also fuel cells. And then you'll need to store this energy, and we'll hear from our keynote speaker about how the advances about how energy can be stored with new materials efficiently. These are just some of the examples of the broadened scope of material science. Other challenges, of course, have to do with human health. As a lot of the world is developing, we need new materials to improve on human health, and we'll hear from Sarah Heilstorn about what's being done in that respect, and that's still material science. Again, as the world is developing, there'll be new buildings, and so we need to think of materials that are renewable for buildings and don't keep adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So you see it in the end, all these developments, they go back to requiring new materials and the development of new materials. So material science really is at the heart of all of engineering in the end. And so we sort of are coming full circle with this idea of, well, enough material science is so broad, what defines our discipline? And in the end, because we're doing soft matter, hard matter, semiconductors, quantum materials, all these fancy materials, you start wondering, well, what defines us as material scientists? And you'll see throughout the day that in the end, what we're doing is still always the general thing of using thermodynamics and kinetics to control the structure of materials at the atomic level, to control defects, so that we can obtain the properties that we want to obtain from the materials that we're making. And so we still are well defined as a discipline, and coming full circle, going back to Bill, who is known for being a wonderful teacher, and his vision that material science is central to all of engineering, and also the general principles of material sciences apply across all sorts of materials. And this is what, I think this is what makes our department so special. We're very inclusive. We don't close ourselves into thinking, well, material sciences is one thing. As the world evolves and the need for new materials evolves, we have evolved our discipline in a modern way to continuously have an impact. And so, so this is sort of where I wanted to introduce today. We have a wonderful program. We will start with Professors Mukherjee and Heilshorn from our department telling us about semiconductors for optoelectronics and soft materials for human health. And then the second part of the morning, we have our keynote speaker, Professor Whittingham, who will be introduced by Sunar Pichai. And then Bill will round out the morning, and he'll be introduced by Wally Rines. So that's all I wanted to say, and I wanted to end by just thanking the people that have really made this happen. The event manager for today, Vincent Armenta. I don't know if he's in the back somewhere there. Okay, well, thank you, Vincent. And thank you, Fever Planck, our DFO of the department, who runs the department. And then all the staff. This was an all-hands-on-deck type of event, so the whole staff really made this happen. So thank you all, and without further ado, our first speaker is Kunal Mukherjee, who will tell us about exciting defects.
Wow. It's such an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege to get to present in front of you, Bill, on work on dislocations. So thank you all for being here. I see there's a presenter here. So I'll be talking to you about dislocations and defects, and specifically what the role of defects is in silicon photonics and sort of bringing the information revolution in front of us. This is my favorite defect. This is the defect that I think about the most. Can you guys see it? Right? So there it is, and there it is. Right? Of course, that's not a real crystal, but these kinds of defects known as dislocations are everywhere in all the materials that we work with. We've probably, I guess a number of alumni have taken a class from Bill where he's actually told you about how dislocations move in materials like metals. This is a very important property of dislocations. Dislocations help you shape materials. Here's a metal just being bent just by applying stress, right? So having a dislocation allows you to do this. It allows you to shape crystals. Without them, we would not be able to shape crystals. We wouldn't be able to move things, change things, deform things. What's all of this got to do with silicon photonics, you might wonder? Well, there's a separate revolution happening. There's a Moore's law for electronics that everybody's aware of, but there's a separate Moore's law that's starting to emerge in photonics, where we're getting all of our optics smaller and smaller, more integrated onto silicon platforms. And the reason for that is obvious. When you make things smaller, things get a better value. And here, for example, I'm showing you the bandwidth for a particular switch. And you can see that there's a very nice growth, an exponential growth in the amount of information that can be processed once you start miniaturizing optics. So Moore's law for electronics, that's been 40, 50 years of our societal growth. There's a Moore's law for optics that's going on at the same time. The problem with optics, or at least with light emission, is that silicon, which is a material that works so well for electronics, does not emit light. That's the saddest thing, right? If it only emitted light efficiently, we wouldn't be, we'd be much, much better off. It does not emit light. Actually, it's kind of interesting. None of the group 4 elements, diamond, silicon, germanium, none of them emit light very efficiently. But all hope is not lost. If you just look a little bit to the left and the right, there have been traditional materials from the 1960s that we know actually emit light very well. So these are the compound semiconductors, so-called because they're compounds, not elements. So the 3-5 semiconductors have been used for the longest time in light emission. So you might ask, well, okay, silicon is great for electronics, silicon's great for every other aspect. What if we just get that one light emitting part made out of a different material and put it on silicon? Wouldn't that solve things? This is the chart that I like. This shows on the x-axis the crystal structure, the size of the crystal. And you'll notice, unfortunately, every single 3-5 semiconductor, the ones that emit light, has a different x-axis value from silicon. And the moment that happens, you get a mismatch in lattice spacing. And what that does is it creates a structure like that. Now, that reminds you very much of the same cactus and the corncob that I showed you, right? So it's a crystal with one bigger lattice spacing on top of a crystal with smaller lattice spacing, and you get dislocations. So the dislocations that we know and love in metals all of a sudden show up in our compound semiconductors. And I'm going to show you through the rest of this talk that compound semiconductors do not like dislocations. right? And so we worked very hard in understanding why they don't like dislocations and how can we engineer these dislocations to solve this problem. So this is an example of a typical device. This is a 3.5 laser. It's a compound semiconductor laser that's grown directly on silicon, so some things will never change. You will have a dislocation at that interface. That dislocation is there because it is trying to mediate that mismatch between the 3.5s being differently sized than the silicon. So that dislocation at the bottom, we call those misfit dislocations. Very apt name, yeah? Misfit dislocations at the bottom. But a dislocation is like inserting a sheet of paper in a stack of paper, right? So when you insert a sheet of paper, you have the paper's edge, but then you also have the other two edges on the side, and those actually are what we call the threading dislocations. So these are the dislocations that the misfit dislocations of the interface, but all dislocations need to terminate on a free surface. This is one of those weird rules of dislocations. And so we get these things that go up through our device. Very, very sad, very horrible. So work from our group is basically understanding why these dislocations are bad. I'm going to show you how this is perhaps the biggest problem in sort of integrating light-emitting materials with silicon. And we'll show you some promising results that we've discovered and developed over the last couple of years in solving this problem of having light-emitting materials on silicon, perhaps for the first time. This image in one slide sort of illustrates part one of why dislocations are bad. So on the left, you're seeing a strain-sensitive map. Maybe many of you might remember that dislocations have strain fields. Right? So you can actually use a nice electron microscopy technique, not even TEM. You can use SEMs today to actually look at the strain field from a dislocation. So that's the image on the left. The image on the right is the light emission map from that same region. And everywhere you see a dislocation on the left, you see darkness on the right. Right? So in a nutshell, this is why dislocations are bad. Because if you want to make a light-emitting material, you don't want to see darkness. Right? If this was the only problem, then this is like having a car with a reduced mileage. It'll still get you from one place to another place. There's a second problem, and that's a bigger problem, which is your car not only has a reduced mileage, it actually breaks down as you're driving. In semiconductors, the dislocations actually grow over time as you're running the device at room temperature. Now, this is data from the Japanese NTT company. Right? In 1995, they were growing these devices on silicon. At time t equals 0 minutes, everything looks nice, wonderful. Right? 10 minutes, 40 minutes, darkness starts to grow in these semiconductors. And these dislocations basically eat up the entire laser over time. So it's not only reduced mileage of your car, but your car breaks down in an hour. And that's why these devices never made it. So it's been a decade-long challenge. For the 1980s, 1990s, people have been trying to combine light-emitting materials with silicon. This is one way people do it today. They actually take these light-emitting materials, they cut them up, and they glue it onto silicon so that you never have to grow it. And when you glue stuff, you don't have dislocations. Now, if that picture on the right reminds you of something, it should remind you of this. Right? Which is, back in the day, this is how people used to make electronics. They used to have discrete components that they used to glue together or join together. And we know how massive the idea of going from that big circuit on the top to the little integrated circuit on the bottom has been. So we know that eventually we need to start doing the same thing. Also for the optics, gluing or bonding materials together is a stopgap, but in the next 10 to 20 years, wouldn't it be great if you could make integrated circuits with photonic materials in just the same way we make integrated circuits with electronic materials? The reason why dislocations are so problematic in semiconductors needs a little bit of an introduction. I showed you how easy it is to bend metal. That's what happens when you try to bend silicon. Silicon shatters. The reason why silicon shatters is because these are strong covalently bonded materials. They're very directional bonding. Remember sp3 hybridization? Right? So all of those bonds are pointed at very specific angles. They don't like moving very much. So dislocations have huge activation energies to move in semiconductors. Whereas in metals, I can bend a metal with my hand some days. Right? So dislocations have huge activation energies, and that makes these semiconductors very brittle. And you should be surprised now. It's like, wait a minute, if dislocations can't move in semiconductors, how are they growing in my laser? And this is the interesting bit. Normally, dislocations in the darkness have very high activation energies. But when you inject electrons in them, they actually start moving at room temperature. This is one of the most interesting phenomena that exists in semiconductors. It's a coupling of electronic properties and mechanical properties. So you can see just by injecting carriers into the semiconductors at room temperature, we're converting an otherwise brittle material into something soft, into something plastic, right? So as a material scientist, we've taken these images in the SEM. You're seeing these dislocations move. Actually, you're seeing just the top view. So you're actually seeing the tips of those threading dislocations move. The entire dislocation's actually running into the page. So you see this, and you're very happy. You're like, wow, we can actually see dislocations move. But then when you try and talk to an electrical engineer, you're like, oh, no, this is why the lasers are dying, because the dislocations are moving in our samples when we don't want them to move. The reason why a lot of the dislocations move when you grow these materials on silicon is because in addition to the lattice mismatch, there's another bigger mismatch that people don't talk a lot about, which is thermal expansion mismatch. So most people grow semiconductors at high temperature, and they cool it down to take it out of the oven, yeah? And at that time, the thermal expansion stress really builds up in a lot of these films. So most of the semiconductor films, these light-emitting semiconductors, have huge thermal expansion strains. So not only is the material soft when you inject electrons into it, but there's huge stresses, so the dislocations want to zip around as fast as possible in your material. We saw this a lot, and we've been thinking about what exactly we can do with this. Here's a light emission map of the same process. Right, so this is gallium arsenide. It's a very important semiconductor. You're just seeing the light emission from gallium arsenide. Little dots, the dots are moving around at room temperature. We discovered by chance that when you start alloying gallium arsenide with small percentages of a slightly bigger atom, we can actually remarkably harden the lattice. For a metallurgist, this is no surprise. Of course, you start alloying differently sized elements, you get alloy hardening, right? This is reasonable. But for a semiconductor group, we're legally allowed to put in like 2 things in gallium arsenide without messing up the electronic properties. Indium luckily happened to be one of those things that we were allowed to put in. It's a significantly bigger atom, and we can, just by putting small percentages of indium, actually block this formation, block the movement of the dislocations. I initially thought I was going to go into some of the details of the Parles barriers. I was like, yeah, not today, but I'm happy to discuss this over coffee. So this is a state-of-the-art laser. This is a laser that's been actually grown directly onto silicon. Here's a visual manifestation of what the depth of a laser looks like. Y-axis is light output. X-axis is current. Right? And you see over 1,000 hours, the light output slowly groups and dies. Right? So this is the state of the art. This is the best we can do today. So 1980, we were doing 40 minutes. 2020, we're doing 900 hours. You're like, okay, that's not that great, right? And it's true, it is not that great. We need to work harder, right? So if you look at those images on the top, there are all these misfit dislocations running horizontally, and they become wiggly, which people who might remember dislocations are like, oh, dislocations are supposed to be straight. They're like straight objects. They're not supposed to become wiggled, right? So there's a lot of interesting phenomena, not just that they move, but they also end up emitting vacancies, point defects. It's the whole host of problems when you have dislocations. But I want to point to something. We said that all the misfit dislocations, these horizontal segments, should be way at the bottom. We should have no dislocations up in that red region, which is my laser. Why do I still see dislocations up in the red region? And here's another view of it. This is the view of the laser. You see all of these dark lines. The dark lines up in the red region, not at the bottom where I want them to be. So there was a bigger problem, and we said, well, let's go back to our old friend thermal expansion. Is it possible that what's actually happening is that all of those black lines that you see are being formed not because of the mismatch in crystal structure, but because of the cool down process? So we had a hypothesis. Indium, we had shown, was so effective at pinning dislocations. Maybe our laser is a giant pinner of dislocations, our entire laser itself. So that's our hypothesis. We said, oh, the laser actually blocks the dislocation from moving during thermal expansion cool down, and it forms these very unusual hairpin structures. Here's the mechanism. We actually confirmed that this is actually what's happening. The misfit dislocations do form during cool down, not during growth. And once you see that this is happening, you use a simple strategy. You said, wait, if indium pins it, let me reuse that pinning effect. So I'm going to put an indium-containing dummy layer above it. I'm going to put an indium-containing dummy layer below it. And I'm simply going to displace where those horizontal segments form. That's all. And the moment we did that, the laser depth got reduced significantly. So we simply displaced where these dislocations were forming. We didn't change the number. We didn't change the density. We understood how they form. And we harnessed indium pinning to stop this from happening. Here's an electron tomogram. So this is like a CT scan of a sample. You can see all of these dark lines. Do you see the ones on the top? They've all been pushed up. They've been pushed up from our laser. Actually, there's one that got away. Do you see the one that got away? It's still on the top. I don't know why. That's why we say 95% of the dislocations have gone. And so this has been remarkable. So we now do these experiments where we take these little lasers, put them in these little oven-sized, like cookie heating ovens, right? And then we run them for a long time. In 2020, the record was the red line, where lasers were lasting about a year before they die at 80 Celsius. Which nobody in industry gets excited about because if they die in a year, you will never buy it. You need to have them last decades. That's how reliable these need to be. And just by using the indium pinning method, we've significantly improved the reliability of these devices. So these today are the record directly grown 3.5 lasers on silicon, surpassing, tens of years of reliability. So we've come a long way since the 1960s and the 1970s, where people were getting the lasers lasting for a day, a month maximum. So all of this is because of our understanding of dislocations. There's still a lot of issues that we don't understand in our group. We don't understand how exactly does injecting charge into the dislocation cause it to move. Why does it glide? Why does it climb? Why does it emit vacancies when I do this? But there's another part of our group that all of this hard lesson, we're like, oh man, dislocations, they're such a pain, right? I love them in metals. I hate them in semiconductors, right? I wish we had materials that weren't affected by them. So that hard lesson from the light-emitting compound semiconductors made us think, maybe the key is metallic bonding. Metals are okay with dislocations. Semiconductors are not okay with dislocations. A lot of them aren't. What if you could find semiconductors that have more metallic bonding motifs? Would we have semiconductors that are more okay with dislocations? And that's basically the next chapter of our group. We've been working a lot. We have some initial results. I will not share any of those with you today, but I'm just saying that that's our motivation. Going forward, we work with traditional semiconductors. We understand how to deal with dislocations. But moving ahead, we want to look at materials that are defect tolerant, where you can have dislocations and they don't damage the material. I wanted to conclude with some light reading. Some light reading because a lot of the work that we have done is actually inspired in part, sometimes even fully, by the papers that Bill wrote. So Bill, this is perhaps one of your most famous papers. It's almost required reading. Everybody who does thin films of semiconductors reads this. People who do thin films perhaps also read Nix and Clemens. Right? So these are some of the classics in the field, and I think everybody's heard of the classics. I want to point to some of the non-classics. The non-classics, the ones that have actually been more influential in our group's research. Look at the title, A Contribution to the Theory of Dislocation Climb. Right? That's so emblematic of Bill's writing style. My favorite paper, Mechanisms and Kinetics of Dislocation Formation, Nix, Nobel, and Turlo. I think it has only 20 to 30 citations. That's it. Right? But it's my favorite paper of yours, Bill, because do you see similarities? Right? So all the work that we do, right, all the work that we have done have sort of been inspired by a lot of the papers that Bill Nix has written in his career. So I've been very grateful for that. So with that, I'd just like to conclude. This is my group. A lot of the work that you saw was done by Jenny Selvage, Eamon Hughes, Brian Haydett, in collaboration with the group of John Bowers at Santa Barbara. The new work that is coming out on defect-tolerant materials, or materials where we want defects, are being done by the rest of the group members here. Lillian, Leland, Jared, Pooja, Tree, Haushway, Bryce, and Kelly. And that's our website. We bagged crystal.stanford.edu, so I'm really happy about that. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you for a wonderful talk connecting the traditional to the new. Our next speaker is Professor Heilshorn, who will tell us how material science can address challenges in human health. Let's welcome Sarah.
Thank you, Alberto. Awesome talk, Kunal. I am so pleased to be here and talking with you all today. To begin, I'd like to do a quick disclosure that some of this technology that I'll be talking about has been licensed. I'd like you to take a moment, maybe glance around the room, and think about what makes you, you. What is unique about you? About the way you look, about your personality, about your hobbies, your intellectual passions, right? What makes you unique? And then, I don't know, do I have anyone in the room who's a twin? Raise your hand if you, yeah, there's, exactly. So, are you unique from your twin? How are you similar, or how are you different? We call identical twins identical, right? Because they came from the same zygote, right? There was a moment in time during early development where a splitting happened, and the genetic information that typically makes one person split to make two, right? And so identical twins often look identical, but not always, right? Why is that? Did you know that even identical twins have different fingerprints? So although their genetic material came from the exact same copy, and some identical twins are actually perfectly identical at the genomic level, and all identical twins are nearly perfectly identical at the genetic level, they're still different. Each one is unique, okay? They are shaped not just by the genetic blueprint, but by the microenvironment, the materials around them. These include the chemical environment, gradients of chemical factors that perfuse through from the placenta, which twin is closer, okay? Mechanical cues, the fluid flow of the amniotic fluid, which one moves around more, which receives more mechanical stimulation. Those things alter the ridges that form on your fingertips, okay? So each individual is unique. Our modern medicine, however, is based on the premise that we can average across all of us, okay? So a one-size-fits-most type of idea. We know that this isn't true. We each responded differently to, for example, COVID. Some get really sick, some don't. There are different prevalences of diseases that are known to happen among different subsets of our population. When we go to try to treat those injuries or diseases, different people respond differently to the exact same therapeutic intervention, right? Some have a positive effect. For others, that exact same therapy might actually make them worse, right? in this short period of time from 97 to 2000, there were drugs that had to be pulled off the market because they negatively impacted a subset of our population. And 8 of 10 of those, their negative impacts were primarily on females, okay? So because of this, our current research guidelines mandate that we must do clinical testing across a diversity of people because we can't predict who's going to respond positively and who's going to respond negatively unless we do the experiment and collect the data, right? When we do preclinical testing in animals, we also must test both in males and females. But at the earliest stages of drug development, when we're working on what is called cell culture or tissue culture, we often don't worry about where did those cells come from a male, from a female, from a Caucasian, from an African American. And so we are losing out on the information that we could gain from thinking about the diversity of our drug development already at the earliest stages of research and development. Okay, so what does this have to do with a material scientist, you might be wondering? So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how cell culture studies are normally done. So normally you take a cell type, a single cell type, because you want it to be as reproducible as possible, and you put it in a petri dish, which is made out of rigid polystyrene. The cells are grown at the bottom, and you put a liquid culture medium on top. Okay? This results in a homogeneous chemical environment, which is not at all what happens inside the body. It results in a homogeneous rigid environment. All of the materials in our body are not as stiff as rigid polystyrene. And so this cell culture paradigm that has advanced modern medicine tremendously is currently holding us back. So one question my group is quite interested in is how could we enable new technologies to allow personalized cell cultures? So tissues, I think of them as materials. They're composites. There's a living component, and then there's a biopolymer component, okay? That is the non-living. And there are decades of fundamental research that explain how the polymer component can impact the living cells and how the living cells can pull and chemically modify the polymer component, right? But we need to begin to put all of this information together to create robust, reproducible, affordable, and scalable tissue culture models for each individual. So currently, the broader biotechnology community is making steps in the right direction. We can now move from these flat 2D cultures to 3-dimensional cultures, so clusters of cells. This is the current cutting edge in cell culture technology. But to do this, a material is used that is isolated from an animal source. So this is a commercially available product. There's several different versions, but they all come from a mouse to which is given a sarcoma. They take the sarcoma, take the cells out, and sell the material that's left behind, the non-living polymer component. Perhaps not surprisingly, if you do a mass spectrometry characterization of that mixture of biopolymers, it's very heterogeneous and complex, and there's very little batch-to-batch similarity, okay? We can't create a robust, reproducible, scalable procedure using these materials. So the goal is really to try to identify some minimal engineered matrix that would allow us to grow these cultures. So in my group, the approach that we like to take is somewhat of a middle ground. So proteins are one component of the biopolymers that are naturally surrounding our cells. And so you could get a protein by isolating it from a plant, from an animal, or the picture here is of seaweed, then you would be isolating a polysaccharide, not a protein. But you could isolate these biopolymers from nature. On one hand, that's great because they've evolved to be bioactive and biodegradable. But just like that material that comes from a mouse sarcoma, they have immense batch-to-batch variability. From a QC point of view, they're just a nightmare. On the other hand, you could have beautiful polymer chemistry and make synthetic materials, so person-made materials, with exquisite precision, right? And you get the exact molecule that you want. Well-defined, customizable, but these materials are bioinert unless we decorate them in some way with peptides or growth factors, which complicates the overall process. So in my group, we take a middle ground bridging approach where we design our own biopolymers, so proteins or polymers made of amino acid monomers. We design that sequence ourselves and make them recombinantly. So you get the exact same material every time. And like Alberto said, I belong in material science because I design molecules from the molecular level up, okay? And so this is the approach we take in my group. And we fabricate these into soft materials that are hydrogels. These are water-swollen networks, mostly composed of water. So they allow really fast and rapid diffusion transport, Fickian transport through. So the cells can receive the nutrients that they need and expel their waste. It might be useful to think of the volume fraction. So in our tissues, especially the highly cellular ones like muscle and brain, cells can take up between 80 to 90% by volume of the overall composite structure. And so we need, if we want to recreate accurate mimics of human tissue, we're not going to get there by printing a rigid polymer and putting a few cells on top, right? We need to mimic this high cellularity function. One family of materials that we've been working on is shown here schematically. We call them HELP for short because the name is a mouthful. It's hyaluronan and elastin-like protein matrix. So in biology, we like to call materials a matrix, but it's a material. And both the hyaluronic acid component, so that's a polysaccharide, the elastin-like protein component, that's a protein, they're both made recombinantly, so they do not come from animal sources. And we chemically modify them so that they have a covalent bond attachment. And this covalent bond is a little bit unique. Normally, we think of covalent bonds as being relatively static, especially at physiological temperatures. These are reversible. So as the cells, which I'm showing here as these three-dimensional balls, as they proliferate and grow, they exert a strain on the material, right, as they're growing in volume. The polymer network around it can remodel and relax that imposed stress. So we use these types of materials for a number of different applications in my group, some focused on trying to scale up the manufacturing of therapeutically useful cells, some where we're interested in taking these materials and actually injecting them to deliver drugs or therapeutic cells. But the two areas, the little stories I'd like to share with you, are highlighted in red on the bottom. First, customized materials for patient-derived cultures, and then some of our ongoing work on using these as inks for bioprinting. So just like your finger ridges, right, come about as a consequence of chemical and mechanical signals that they're receiving from the microenvironment around them during development. If you have a disease, the progression of that disease changes depending on the microenvironment around those abnormal cells. So how can we use our materials to study that process? And in particular, we were interested in studying the disease pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. Okay, so pancreatic cancer. It has a very low 5-year survival rate. The frontline chemotherapy that is used to treat this disease was introduced in 1996. But unfortunately, only about 10% of patients are responsive to this chemotherapy drug. And so often, it's given in combination with other chemotherapy. The success rate is still, though, much, much too low. So we took samples from patients at the Stanford Hospital of healthy pancreas and of PDAC, right, pancreatic cancer, and saw that the matrix, the material that surrounds the cells in these PDAC tumors, is greatly increasing. The cells pump out lots and lots of matrix as the tumors progress. And in particular, hyaluron, that's our hyaluronic acid, and this protein called fibronectin. They're shown in green and pink. And that results in a stiffening of the tumor, okay? And we can mechanically measure these samples. So now we can create models in the lab using hyaluronic acid and using amino acid sequences from fibronectin. So these are the two components that get upregulated in pancreatic cancer. And then tune the amount of covalent cross-linking in our networks to create a family of hydrogels that we've designed that have a tunable stiffness to match that of the commercially available material, which is Coldtrex. That's that material that comes from a mouse sarcoma. And then our healthy pancreas, and then the stiffness of a tumor. Okay, so we have these differing materials that we can create in the lab. And when we grow samples from a biopsy of pancreatic cancer and then try to treat with the chemotherapy, we can check and see how do the cells respond. In these data here, in red, I'm staining for a marker that says the cells are beginning to undergo programmed cell death. That's what we want. We want the cancer cells to die. And you see that as we increase the stiffness of these materials, the cells become less sensitive to the chemotherapy. This was an exciting finding for us because it suggests that there might be a molecular mechanism that links the mechanical properties of the tumor environment and their susceptibility to drug treatment. by checking a number of different hypotheses, what we've learned is that when cells are exposed to this mechanically stiff environment, they create more copies of these pumps that I'm showing in this cartoon as little green channels that span the cell membrane. So the drug can actually make it to the cells, but the cancer cell pumps it back out as quickly as it comes in. And so there are a number of these pumps. They're called efflux transporters. Their genetic names are shown across the x-axis. And they all get upregulated when you simply grow cells from, and the cells all came from the same patient. We just changed the stiffness of the microenvironment in which we grew them. And then my student did a really clever experiment. So this is just another way of showing, of quantifying that data that you already saw through the micrographs. The IC50 is the concentration at which 50% of the cells would die in response to the drug treatment. And so you can see in our high stiffness gels, as the passage of time goes on, the cells become more resistant. You have to give more drug to kill 50% of them. But if you take those cells and you now switch them and put them into a low stiffness environment, they regain their sensitivity to the drug. You can also do the reverse. If we take them from a low stiffness material into a high stiffness material, we can transform them into being less sensitive. This is super exciting because it suggests that we can come up with a molecular way to interrupt this mechanical signaling that might allow this old drug to have a new intended use and to give new sensitivity to this particular drug. So I'll next talk just a little bit about some bioprinting work we've been doing. So 3D printing has become very common. My 9-year-old is begging for a 3D printer for his 10th birthday. Right? A lot of schools, public libraries have 3D printers. In bioprinting, it looks a lot like the type of printing that you would see in these settings. You extrude a polymer. The difference is you have cells inside the polymer material. Okay, cells cannot be heated up. We're all at body temperature, about 37 degrees Celsius, so we can't use thermoplastics for this process, right? So we need to formulate the polymer matrix a little bit differently. And it turns out what makes a polymer matrix a really great ink in terms of resolution of printability often is the exact opposite set of things we need for that polymer to have good cell interactions. And so there is a large effort globally underway to try to design new materials that would live in this upper quadrant here, right? That would be both biofunctional and give us good resolution. Those help materials that I presented earlier, they're injectable. So here's a video of one being injected out, but they're not printable, right? You can see they undergo fracture, right, of a discrete size. And so if you try to print something, it doesn't look that good. You don't get nice, smooth filament extrusion, you get droplet breakup. So what if we now go in and begin to tune both the thermodynamics and the kinetics of this cross-linking reaction, right? We can use a competitor to block some of the cross-linking sites. So initially, in the syringe, we don't have a fully cross-linked network. And we can also use the catalyst to increase the forward and reverse reaction rate without altering the thermodynamic equilibrium constant of our reaction. After you print, right, so that lowers the yield stress, adding the catalyst. After it prints, these small molecules can diffuse out and your network can form, leaving behind a nice, robust gel. So this works really well. We now can achieve smooth filaments that we can pattern into different types of three-dimensional shapes and print different types of structures. Now, the types of things we can print here are individual single cells. But the last little story I'd like to tell you is trying to print something that's much bigger. So these little spheres that I'm showing here are collections of cells, great big balls of cells, because that's how the cells are in our body. They're interacting with each other. They have lots of cell-cell connections that are important for their function. So if we really want to move towards creating mimics of your tissue and your tissue and your tissue, we need to recreate these cell-cell connections. So you can take a biopsy, a skin biopsy or a blood draw, and use those cells to make what are called induced pluripotent stem cells. From these stem cells, we can create these spheres that recreate some of the cellular connections that are found in the brain. So these are termed brain organoids or neural organoids. And you can make ones that look like the front part of the brain, ones that look more like the back part of the brain. And then you can put them together to create what my colleague Sergio Pasha calls assembloids. So now we have these spheres of cells that we want to position. It turns out these are very fragile. We've been measuring the mechanical properties of these three-dimensional living tissues. They plastically deform quite easily. So to move them, we have to be very gentle. And so my team has created a different type of printing procedure. We couldn't use the extrusion that is more frequently done. And so we coat the surface with little magnetic nanoparticles, and then use an electromagnet to levitate this little ball of cells and move them and position them where we want. Turn the magnet off, and it stays in place. We can repeat this multiple times to create and build up different three-dimensional structures of these organoids to make cute little things like pyramids, lines, and rings. But more importantly, we're beginning to use this to create models of individual patients' disease states. So working with cells from Michel Mange's group in Stanford Hospital, we're looking at a type of brain cancer that afflicts our pediatric population and are beginning to scale up to create multiple wells of these little, so you can take the cancer cells and position them next to one of these neural organoids and begin to look at the cell infiltration and then importantly do the drug screening experiments. So here's a set of wells, each of which has one of these assembloids inside of it. So the take-home messages that I'd like to leave you with, again, beginning with this understanding that each individual is unique. Bringing it back to Bill, I think this is something I've always appreciated about his approach to academia, to science, to mentorship. The individual was always put first, always putting people first. And that was a wonderful lesson to learn as a new assistant professor in the department. And that the design of materials at this molecular level can be used to create mimics of each individual's tissue. I'd like to thank my research team and my sponsors who help us do this work. I mentioned Sergio and Michelle by name. On the pancreatic cancer side, we work with Christina Curtis and Calvin Kuo at the Stanford Medical School. And I'd also like to acknowledge the individuals who have graciously donated their tissue samples to us. Thank you so much. If there's time, I'd be happy to take questions.
If the growth of the additional pumps, I forgot what the word was, but on the outside, if that might be due to a reduction in diffusion in the extracellular material because of the additional polymer and not necessarily the mechanical properties.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we have measured the diffusional transport rate across all of our materials, and they are similar. So and that was long. Inside the body, there may indeed be transport limitations, and that's something that many cancer specialists are looking into, that perhaps the drug simply can't get to the cancer effectively because we deliver it systemically, right? Usually as an infusion. But in these experiments, we were very careful to dissect out those two experimental variables. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if there might be cases where you want to protect certain parts of your body by stiffening it somehow.
Yeah. So there are ways. So as we age, our tissues mostly naturally stiffen, become more fibrotic. You accumulate cross-linking and stiffness, and your matrix loses some of its elasticity. There are some experimental drugs that can interfere with some of these processes, but one needs to be really cautious about applying them to the body because of potential unintended consequences in other tissues of the body where you're not targeting, right? So one way around that is to develop injectable therapies that would not be like a pill you take or something that gets added into your vascular system so it goes everywhere, but instead would be localized inside a gel, and then maybe you would just deliver that gel, inject it directly into the tumor or into the heart tissue if you have a heart attack, et cetera. And so that is an approach that you can use if you want to try to deliver something to either locally stiffen or weaken the matrix for a therapeutic response. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you to both speakers this morning. It was really wonderful. So our next speaker is our keynote speaker, Professor Whittingham, and he will be introduced by Sunar Pichai.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alberto. It's really great to be back with the MSc department. Definitely brings back a lot of great memories. I just saw my former advisor, Professor Sean Wong, here. I do recall showing up for a few Monday morning meetings, not having done the work you asked me to. So maybe not all great memories, but it's so great to be here. It's my immense honor to introduce Professor Stan Whittingham at the inaugural Nix Lecture. But first, let me acknowledge the namesake who brings us here today, the great Bill Nix. As a new graduate student, I remember being in awe of Bill and hearing stories of the enormous impact he had on the lives of so many people in the field. It's only fitting that the first lecture in his name be given by someone who shares Bill's passion for material science and its power to positively impact society, Dr. Stan Whittingham. Stan joined the Stanford Material Science Department in 1968 to work with the legendary Bob Huggins. Stan joined Bob to continue his very early work on the thermodynamics of lithium silicon. Their work to harness lithium, which is highly reactive, and get it to behave was nothing short of revolutionary. The advancements in battery technology he led are the reason that billions of people around the world can access knowledge and computing on mobile phones and laptops. Stan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2019 for his efforts. Today, what we are asking of the element lithium and the lithium-ion battery technology is increasing. The race to decarbonize our economy will not be possible without the efforts of people in this room to develop new battery technologies for energy storage, including what may replace the lithium-ion battery in the future. Stan also did early work on electric vehicles, another example of how he was ahead of his time. All of the students in the room today are now building on the progress of trailblazers like Stan and Bill, growing our understanding of the properties of materials. We are excited to see what breakthroughs you'll all help achieve and the impact you'll have on society too. We'll have leaders like Stan Whittingham to thank, and I'm glad to invite him to the stage now. Stan?
Thank you very much for those kind words. What I want to do today is really go back to the beginning and give you a little bit of history. So you'll see where I came from, what I've done, and how we came about with the lithium battery and what we're going to be doing next. But first of all, I have to thank Department of Energy. They supported my work since about 1992 on a continuous basis. So without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. And I show you on this slide a couple of examples of where lithium batteries are being used. You all know about this little storage facility down the street on the bay. And as of 3 days ago, United is now using a Jaguar electric car to take their guests from one plane to the next plane. And I was lucky to get one of those cars on Saturday morning. But let me know, I don't think I really need to tell any of you that we've got climate issues. So I just show you a few examples. These all within the last 12 months from all around the globe. And I'm particularly familiar with the Victoria Glacier in Banff. We used to have a ceramics meeting there every 2 years. And every time we went, it got further and further away, and it's essentially disappeared now. And it's not unique. So let me just tell you a bit about my history so you know where I came from and what my background is and how I landed up at Stanford and a few other places. So I got my undergraduate degree at Oxford in chemistry, and Oxford at that time had 3 different chemistry departments. The inorganic chemistry department included metallurgy. Material science didn't exist back then, but metallurgy did. And I got my courses in metallurgy from one William Rothery. Some of your students should remember who he is. And his office was just 2 doors down from my lab. And the area of research I got into was the same rationale that got material science going in this country. The Russians had just put Sputnik up there, and I would say this was panic in Washington. So the Air Force Office in London supported my work. At Oxford, for undergraduate degree in chemistry, Oxford, you had to do a year of research at the end of it. So we looked at how oxygen atoms recombined on these tunnel structures, which you call tungsten bronzes. Very easy to modify these structures, so we could look at the electronic and geometric factors. I then went on to get my doctorate there, and I had a very fortunate, I got what's called a Gas Council scholarship to do my doctorate. I got it, I think, in June. In August, the gas industry struck methane in the North Sea, and they said, we're not interested in what you're doing, just do whatever you like, and send us a copy of your thesis at the end. And that's a wonderful position to be in. So again, we looked at these same tunnel structures, looking at how they got reduced by hydrogen, how the ions moved within the structure. And you'll see the theme I've had is ions all the time. So at the end of that, I decided, no, enough of rainy England. Tom Halstead from Oxford had come to work with Bob Huggins, so I came, and I think over the next 10 years, maybe half a dozen other postdocs came from Oxford. I was here maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Then Bob Huggins moved to Washington to run the materials programs in Department of Defense and now in NSF. And Bill Nix took over, advising me, and I think we met once a term. And he said, keep going, everything's good. And there are a few folks in the audience. Doug Clark is right here, who was a graduate student in the group at that time. And Turgut Gur was a new student, and his wife was my technician in that group. So it's a small world. For the work I did here at Stanford, we got the Young Author Award of the Electrochemical Society. Then I went off to what was then ESSO, and ESSO wanted to be the Bell Labs of the energy industry. So our charge was to work on anything we liked in the energy area, provided it was not petroleum or chemicals. So we got working on fuel cells, batteries, and probably most of you don't know that Exxon was the largest manufacturer of solar photovoltaic cells at that time. And they did all their nuclear reprocessing for the United States up in Washington State at that time before the US stopped it. So they're very big in alternative energy. That's where we made the first lithium batteries, and I'll get into those a little later. Then in '88, I went back to academia as kind of the lone materials person. And at that time, mid-'80s, all the solid-state chemists and most of the solid-state physicists were in industry. But you can think of Bell Labs, IBM, Exxon. Those solids were dirty. It was no different than here at Stanford. There were no solid-state people in the physics department or the chemistry department. They were either in material science or in applied physics. But in the early 80s, I think academia suddenly realized solids matter, and they sucked all of us out of industry back to academia. So let me just say a little bit of what we did here. In 1967, Ford Motor Company published a paper on this compound called beta alumina. They claimed the sodium ions moved just as fast in the solid as they did in aqueous solutions. And it's called beta alumina because it's thought to be just another polymorph of aluminum oxide, but it was Linus Pauling who said, no, this is a layered structure, and I show you at the bottom here. And it's gamma alumina blocks with these very open structures where the ions can very readily move in there. In reality, this material has about 15% excess sodium. And this is what allows it to move those sodium ions fast. And the material itself is used as a liner in glass tanks. So we get large quantities of it. And the key thing, we get single crystals up to maybe 1 inch in length. Now, we didn't have to grow them ourselves, so we can make them. So the challenge we had, we wanted to know just how fast these ions move. And they move so fast you can't use what we call blocking electrodes like platinum. You had to have electrodes where the ions moved as well. So what we used were these sodium tungsten bronzes, sodium vanadium bronzes, same compounds I'd used for my doctorate. And those ions can move from, we didn't describe it as such in those days, but the cell I show you there is really a solid-state battery. You have your solid electrolyte, the beta alumina in the middle, and then you have your two solid electrodes, the tungsten bronze or the vanadium bronze. And we managed to measure the conductivity from liquid nitrogen temperature up to 800 degrees centigrade, and I think it's still the material with a single diffusion mechanism over the largest temperature range anybody knows. And we had difficulty explaining it to physicists. We said this was an interstitial mechanism, and we got comments back from, I think, Journal of Chemical Physics, there's no such thing. So we had to copy a page out of a standard textbook and mail it back to them. We got a big apology, it's accepted. So that's what got us into fast ion transport, and there's papers on this work that got me the Young Author Award at the Electrochemical Society. But just in case anybody in here doesn't know how their lithium-ion battery works, and is there anybody in this room who wants to raise their hand and say they haven't got a lithium-ion battery on them somewhere? So all batteries have an anode and a cathode, and the technology we discovered basically at Exxon is we're going to insert these ions into a lattice, a host lattice, without changing that lattice at all, except maybe a slight expansion. And that's why we can put lithium ions in, take them back out. So we worked on titanium disulfide at Exxon. Titanium disulfide is not almost unique, it's a metallic conductor itself. So you can get the electrons in very easily as well as the lithium ions very easily. So that's the electrode on the right-hand side, the cathode. On the left-hand side, we used initially pure lithium metal. And we have a few issues about that, and I'll get on that later. Then in the middle, we have the electrolyte. That's typically nowadays an organic solution with some lithium salt dissolved in it. So I gave a talk at ExxonMobil a couple of years ago, and you see the original pictures on the left-hand side. Me just a few decades younger, I think. And beneath that was our titanium disulfide. We use large single crystals. And they said they're metallic conductors, so that didn't give any issues. On the right-hand side are two of the cells we made. The top one's a paperweight, which we gave away to potential customers. That particular one is in my home that's still working today. And we built it, we think, about 1976. Beneath that are large cells we built for electric vehicles. And these particular ones turned a motorcycle headlamp on and off at EV show in Chicago in 1977. Those of you who look closely, you'll see we have pressure release valves on the top, because we were using some solvents which tended to gas. So as soon as the crowds left for the day, we would release any pressure that was inside. But these just sat on a table with just a small plastic screen in front of them, so people would get very close. And that was the original patent, and I'm not sure you can play the same games today. We invented the battery in 72, we filed the patent in 73, then Exxon played games now. Continuation in part to delay its release so people wouldn't know they were working on batteries. So where are we now? This will show you that we actually went, Bob Hamlin, who was from GE, he ran the manufacturing facility. We went in our basements and found a few cells, and these now sit in the Nobel Museum in Stockholm, together with a brochure we gave out to customers. But this is where we are now in transportation. I'll show you a few examples there. The top three vehicles are ones we actually drove. So that's my wife and I in Bermuda. In one of the first 2 or 3 vehicles that tourists could actually drive in Bermuda. Tourists have to rent a moped, and we weren't about to rent a moped. They said, we've got these new electric vehicles, and by the way, if you drive to the other end of the island, you better charge it up before you come back. It won't make it back. So we drove to the other end of the island, went to the charging station, and they were still building it. So we got part way back to a restaurant, got it partially charged, and we managed to get back to the hotel before it completely stopped. On the right-hand side are 2 trucks. These are Paccor's test facility just north of Seattle, Washington. And in 2019, a group of us got to drive these around their test tracks. The only comment they said on the 16-wheeler, please don't go over 60 miles an hour and don't go up into the bank corners. But otherwise, no, these are totally electric. This particular truck, I think, is in the LA docks now, moving containers short distances. The other one's a garbage truck. That's a clear, obvious use of electric vehicles. It's stop, start, raise, lower all day long. Beneath that, I'll show you a few buses. These are all in commercial use now. The forklift trucks are Raymond. This is a division of Toyota, and they're made in Binghamton. The BAE buses there are also made in Binghamton. Whilst we were in Stockholm, 2 of the physicists and I got to talk to these 2 astronauts on the International Space Station, and it turned out they'd just finished, about a few days beforehand, replacing all the old nickel metal hydride batteries with lithium-ion batteries, which stored the solar energy on the space station. They were very happy. They weighed half as much, took up half the volume, and they were supposed to last twice as long. And the lady on the right is of Swedish origin, but comes from Maine in the US, and the fellow is from Italy. And what was amazing, we spoke to them, and the response was instantaneous. Not this delay you remember from many, many years ago. In the renewable energy area, all of you know, if you've got solar or wind, at nighttime the sun doesn't shine and the wind tends to be stronger at nighttime, so you have to do storage. So I show you a few examples there. There's a West Virginia wind farm. That's one of the earliest uses of batteries. All the way on the right-hand side at the bottom is a initial storage facility with lithium iron phosphate batteries in it in Binghamton. This was placed next to a coal power plant. 1 month later, they turned the coal power plant off, and it's never gone on again. So it did its job, and we're very proud in New York State we don't generate a single kilowatt hour of electricity from coal anymore. In the middle there's that huge facility in Moss Landing, which right now is, the one facility is 1.6 gigawatt hours. This one's got approval to go to 5 gigawatt hours. There's another company also building the same battery system on the same site. So this was an old gas storage, gas power plant, so all the grid facilities was all there, so it's low cost to replace it. So why don't we have lithium batteries? Why do you all have lithium-ion batteries? You can see, all being material scientists, you know what happens when you try to electroplate a metal out. It will tend to form these dendrites, and these dendrites basically short out batteries. And this is a operando picture that Russ Kennelly took at Exxon back in the 70s. On the right-hand side is some AT&T booster power systems. I think this was in Texas, on cells built with Avastor using lithium and a solid polymer electrolyte. And over about a month's time, 5 of these caught fire. So that was the end of lithium batteries for almost every application. So from lithium, we moved to other electrodes. Exxon had recognized the issue with lithium, so our cells that we made in the end used a lithium aluminum alloy. So all of you in the semiconductor business fully know the last thing you want near any of your semiconductors is lithium metal. It reacts with everything. So it reacts spontaneous with aluminum to form a 1-to-1 alloy, and that's what we use in our cells. It doesn't work all that well. It works for maybe 10 to 20 cycles, but that's all we needed in those days, because the watches in our initial products were LED displays, not LCD. So you had to recharge the battery every 3 or 4 months, and that's where we used them. The big breakthrough was really when Akira Yoshino in Japan started working on graphite, and same intercalation reactions as with titanium disulfide. Lithium goes into the lattice, and in a very reversible manner. The only problem is you store 6 grams or 7 grams of lithium for every 70 grams of carbon. So very inefficient, and the carbon takes up half the volume of the cell. So right now that has to go, and there's a lot of work now working on tin, and a number of spin-offs from Stanford I know are working on silicon. But our long-term goal is to get back to pure lithium metal if we can make it to operate it in a safe manner. And I should say, so then it went to Exxon. They sold this technology when they decided in the early 80s that the market wasn't $100 million a year. And they basically sold all their alternative energy, including a chip company in the Bay Area, and that's the only one they made much money on, and they made millions on that one. They sold the battery technology to one Japanese company, one US company which we know is Everready, and one European company who I don't know. Everready then had a partnership with Sony, and basically all that technology went over to Japan, and it was Sony who really made the first commercially successful, and I emphasize successful, lithium-ion batteries. Other companies had made them. Moly Energy in Canada was one of them. But Sony actually made it commercially successful because they were vertically integrated. They wanted it in their devices. So I make 2 points here. One, Exxon dropped the ball. What would have happened had they kept in renewable energy? It'd be a totally different scenario. And eventually, Sony dropped the ball. And they let Apple and Samsung take over all the devices. None of you, I suspect, have a Sony device in your pocket right now, or very few of you. On the cathode side, we worked on the layered compound lithium titanium disulfide. It worked very well, but the energy density wasn't all that high. John Goodenough, who was at Oxford at the time, working on the magnetic behavior of the lithium cobalt oxide, said, hey, these two structures are the same. Let's see if cobalt oxide will work. Well, no self-respecting chemist would look at lithium cobalt oxide. Cobalt-4 doesn't exist according to chemistry textbooks. But John was a physicist. He said, I'm going to try it, and no, that was history. So all your small devices are still pure lithium cobalt oxide, your watches, your iPhones. But cobalt is expensive. There's huge child labor issues in the Congo. So there's been a huge push to replace the cobalt with a mixture of nickel, manganese, and aluminum, and that's what's in most systems today, what we call NMC. Then about 18 years ago, John then found out that the lithium iron phosphates would intercalate lithium in and out again, and I should emphasize, John was not looking for lithium iron phosphate. He was trying to make a Nasicon compound. And they kept getting this impurity in there. So they decided, well, let's make this impurity pure. And that's when they found this works. This is the material that ought to be used in all grid storage. There's no expensive metals. It's safer. It doesn't involve oxygen. I'll show you a slide in a moment about that. But it's low energy density. So right now we're trying to look at the same phosphates, but where we can put 2 lithiums in to the crystal lattice. So a lot of people say, well, you folks got the Nobel Prize. No, R&D is finished in this field. We don't need to do any more. But if you look inside that red oval there, you'll see what we actually get out of a commercial cell varies between 11% and 25% of the theoretical amount. So there's a huge incentive to at least double that. And it's the same on the weight side. We get about 25% out. And I'm part of the Battery 500 consortium, as is SLAC here. And our goal is to get that up to 50% and get the energy density up to 500 watt-hours per kilogram. I said, in these cells, the graphite anode is a big issue. Most of that has got to go. We need to get more lithium into these cells. And on the fundamental end, we need to get this lithium to move faster, and we need to get the cathode materials to be more electronically conductive. Then we can make the electrodes thicker. So one way of closing this gap is to put more nickel in the material. This will increase the energy density, and this happened not so much to increase the energy density, it reduced the cost dramatically. If you double the amount of nickel in there, you cut by more than half the amount of cobalt. And cobalt is the driver of the cost of these materials. But the challenge in these materials is the more nickel you put in, the more the material tends to evolve oxygen. And I'll show you some temperatures in here. If you heat these materials up in TGA, this is where they will lose oxygen. They will lose oxygen at room temperature, given the right catalyst to do it. And this is what tends to give you fires and thermal runaway. But the more nickel you have in there, the higher the energy density. So the goal is to push the nickel content up, push the energy density up, and make them safer. And I'll show you in a moment how we can do that. No one expects these batteries to get this hot, but this temperature scale is a measure of their reactivity with the electrolyte. So the lower the temperature of the evolution, the more reactive they are with these organic solvents. And this is the present status of the Battery 500 project. We started out, I think, 6 years ago. We managed, I think, to get about 50 cycles out at 300 watt-hours per kilogram. That's about 50 higher than the commercial cells. These use pure lithium metal anodes. They used ether-based electrolytes, because ether-based electrolytes plate out lithium better. Essentially the same electrolytes at that time as we used back at Exxon, but then now much improved. A year later, we got over 200, and a year after that, we increased the energy density up to 350, and I think as of the present time, we've got about 800 cycles out of these materials, and this is 60% nickel. We're working on 80% nickel to get the energy density even higher, but we're not allowed to talk about that in a public meeting like this because it now falls under export control. So we have this little, what I call a fiasco. If we publish it, then we can talk about it. So we're still busy working on that, and I should emphasize the materials we use are what we call these meatballs. They're about 10 microns across. The primary particles are a few hundred nanometers in size. And those cause some issues, and I'll get back to that. But I want to emphasize all the data I show you on these slides is real data. It's not extrapolated. So my ex-student Jay Xiao, who's at Pacific Northwest National Lab, they get these cells, they weigh them, they measure the volume of them, and then they do the cycling based on that. And the cycling is then done at Idaho National Lab. So something we try to tell all the startup companies, we won't believe your data until you send your materials to a third party and have it tested, and because it's just too much exaggeration at the moment. So one of the issues with all these layered oxides, we lose 10 to 15% of the capacity on the very first cycle. So we can take the lithium out, we cannot get it all back in. And we wanted to understand why this is and see if we could solve it. And it's a typical thing a material scientist would do. We looked at it and said, the lithium ions must be diffusing too slowly. So you can see the solid circles there, lithium ions going into the lattice. And you can see once we get above about 70% lithium, the diffusion coefficient drops by 3 orders of magnitude. And this is because turns out it's a divacancy mechanism. So for lithium ion to jump in these 2 vacancies, this room isn't a good example, but if you have a normal lecture hall, that lecture hall is 75% full. The empty seats are all singles in the middle of the lecture hall. So to get the next person in, everybody has to move. It's the same with these lithium cells. And taking the lithium out, there's no such problem. Those are the open circles. So it can all flow out without any issues. So you can do fast charging with these materials, but not necessarily fast discharging all the way. So we said if it's kinetic, then if we raise the temperature, then we should reduce this loss. And you can see all the way on the right-hand side is data at 45 degrees centigrade, in the middle is at room temperature, and you see this loss is reduced. And the way we do this, we charge it, then discharge at 2.8 volts, then hold it at 2.8 volts. And you can see we get most of it back in if we just hold it there. So we said we've got to solve this. How do we improve the diffusion? And the clue here is lithium cobalt oxide itself does not have this issue. Same layered structure. So we said if we modify our mixed metal oxides to make them more like lithium cobalt oxide, we should be able to solve this problem. And the top slide there shows you an NMC with 80% nickel. And we charge them all to about 125 milliampere hours per gram, both of them. And you can see the black curve there is room temperature. If we held it there for 100 hours, all lithium goes in. If we raise the temperature, then the red curve there at 45, most of it goes in without that need to hold. Lithium cobalt oxide, it all goes in straight away. So we said, let's modify our NMC by substitution or coating, and we did this using various lithium niobium oxide films. Lithium niobium oxide is known to be a reasonably good lithium ion conductor, so we coated the entire surface, the lithium could still go through it. So we added the niobium to the meatballs, just put a solution there, soaked it, then we fired it to get it to either coat the material, or we went to higher temperature, it would substitute totally in lattice. And I show you a schematic of those meatballs. It turns out when the niobium atom goes into the lattice, it kicks out a manganese, so the actual surface coating is a mixed lithium niobium manganese oxide. It's not just niobium. And you can see from the curve on the right, we've now reduced this first cycle loss by 50% with just 1% niobium in the material. And this is basically stabilizing the material and also allowing the lithium ions to transfer much more readily. So we looked at this a bit harder, and our colleagues at DOE said, you can't have this extra heating step. This is going to cost too much. So we said, well, we'll add the niobium at the same time we add the lithium. And this is what we did. And in this case, we again put from 1% up to about 3-4% niobium in there. And you can see the results on the right-hand side. The purple is the material with 2% niobium in it. It's cycled for 200 cycles, and there's absolutely no loss of capacity at all. And this is fired about 600 degrees centigrade to get niobium all the way into the lattice. How does it save it? Well, it turns out it basically cuts down on the cracking. So it modifies the mechanical behavior of those primary particles so they don't crack. So you can see on the left-hand side there's 90% nickel. No niobium, you can see big cracks. On the right-hand side, the cracks are much smaller and doesn't degrade the material. If you get big cracks, then the electrolyte goes into those cracks, forms another surface film there, and increases the resistance. So I said, today we use meatballs. We didn't originally use meatballs here at Exxon. We basically did the same thing as with beta alumina. Let's use large single crystals. And we had 3 sizes of single crystals, what we call battery grade, which is a higher surface area, chemistry grade. And then the physicists had the physics grade. The physics ones were like several millimeters long, so they could all put all their tabs on there and measure their physical properties. But these are the ones typically we use for commercial cells. They're maybe 100 microns thick, and I know I mixed units. Now they're inch in the long dimension. So these work well. When Sony built lithium cobalt oxide, they were concerned about safety. So they want to make their materials as large particles as possible. The picture I show you here is has a 5 micron scale on it. This is from Jeff Dahn. Sony was in fact going up to 20 micron size crystals to reduce reactivity. And then commercially today we use these meatballs, and it's now been a big push for the last maybe 2 years. Why don't we go back to single crystals? These have less surface area, less reactivity, and they shouldn't crack. The issue with the meatballs is the primary particles expanding in different directions, so it's the meatball itself that cracks rather than the primary particle. So Jeff and others have done studies on these materials. If you don't stress them, he claims you can get the equivalent of 1,000,000 miles if you put them in a car. I should emphasize Jeff is kind of chief scientist for Tesla. So Tesla supports all his work back in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Why would you want 1,000,000 miles? It means you can actually connect your vehicle to the grid at all times when it's not actually moving. So your local utility can take electricity out of your battery, put it back in. So if they have a grid issue, peak power, or whatever, they can use your battery as a backup. So some companies, I know Tesla, say you'll void the warranty if you do it. The new Ford pickup is designed to do exactly that. Okay. So that's what's happening there. The next challenge really, what are the best single crystals? What shape should we use? Now, do we want octagons, plates? And this again, my colleague Jay Zhao is working on this. And she says if you keep the single crystals below 3 microns, they will not crack. And we learned that with TiS2 as well, keep them below a certain size. So now we have to find out how can you easily make single crystals in an economically viable way. And I should emphasize these NMCs, they're not economically sound manufacturing. The firing is all batch processes in pots, is not a continuous process. And that really needs to change. Moving on from some of these layered compounds, as I mentioned, lithium iron phosphate was thought to be a good material. It didn't involve oxygen. It was stable. And it has a nice flat discharge platter, which everybody thought was great. If you read Tesla's owner's manual, some of the Tesla cars have LFP in them. There's a huge problem when it's flat. You don't know whether it's 90% full or 90% empty. So they advise all owners, as soon as you get home, plug it in, so it's always fully charged. But folks are looking at how can we modify that. So what we're doing now is looking at some vanadium compounds where you can get 2 electrons in. And I should emphasize the gigafactory across the street from where we are is using a variation of lithium manganese phosphate. That's 4 volts versus the 3 volts of iron phosphate. So we looked at vanadium, and if you remember back to your freshman chemistry days, vanadium can go from 5+ to 4+ to 3+. So we can easily go from 5+ to 3+. So we can do a 2-electron redox process and put 2 lithium ions in there. With TiS2 and the layered oxides, you can't really do that. It's a nice 3-dimensional structure with tunnels in it, so it's very stable. It took us a while to make the material in what we call battery grade, and where it would react with lithium. All phosphates are outstanding electronic insulators. So you've got to make it in a particle size in a manner where you can get those electrons to move. So we used a straight hydrothermal solver thermal process, made this hydrogen intercalated material and fired it up to get the protons out. We can get the protons out in an electrochemical cell as well. And this is what we call cuboids. We make these 100 to 200 nanometers in size. And on the right-hand side, you can see the cycling behavior we had in these materials. The 5+ to 4+ is about 4 volts, and the 4+ to 3+ is about 2.5 volts. If you look closely, the black curve is the first cycle, the purple one is the 50th cycle. If anything, it behaves better on the 50th cycle than the first cycle. So we had proof of concept. You can put 2 ions into a crystalline lattice without destroying that lattice. Challenges today are to stop these materials reacting with the organic solvents. These vanadium phosphates are commercially known oxidation catalysts, so we have to moderate their reactivity, but the material itself seems to last forever. I'm getting a bit off the science now and a bit more into the needs. So these intercalation systems we've worked on, they're now exactly 50 years old. We don't anticipate anything else knocking them off their pedestal for at least, I would say, next 5 to 10 years. Any new systems got to come in with better economics, and that's going to be very difficult when you're making billions of cells with lithium ion. What we do need is new manufacturing technologies. To make a 1 kilowatt hour battery today, it takes between 60 and 80 kilowatt hours of energy. And some of these battery components travel somewhere between 30 and 50,000 miles from the mine to the finished product, which is crazy. Okay? And basically what we're saying is we shouldn't be trying to follow the Asians. We've got to leapfrog them and get the next generation of systems. We need clean recycling technologies. We've got to make it sustainable. So I think something like 80 and 90% of all your phones, watches, and other toys land up in the dump. They're pure cobalt, so there's a huge amount of dollars wasted there. So there's now a big push to get those recycled. To eliminate some of the costs, we've got to have regional supply chains, and Europe's put in several $1 billion to do this. They're going to do their mining in Scandinavia, process the materials in Scandinavia using clean hydropower, and then make the batteries in Central Europe. The real question is, does America have the will to do it? And I keep emphasizing when I talk to DOE and the federal government, it's America. Stop talking about the United States, because Canada has so much clean hydropower. They have nickel, they have graphite, they have lithium. It's all up there. We've got to work together and not keep looking inwards. So what we're doing is trying to address some of that. So basically, as you all know, when COVID came, most of you probably couldn't get masks easily, unless you had many, Chinese students had gone back to China and they would send me emails, how many masks do you want this week? And so we'd get shipment of masks coming in from China at that time. But you all see it in the semiconductor industry, it's now in the battery industry. These global supply chains don't work if everything's concentrated too much in any one area. So we need security, we need sustainability. For these special elements like cobalt, we've got to work as scientists and replace those by more readily available elements, or locally source them. So right now there is a cobalt mine opened up, I think about 3 weeks ago in Idaho. But that material now gets shipped to either Brazil or Finland to be processed. And probably most of you know, you've been in startups, to get approval to do anything in the United States, even the first step takes longer than the Chinese take to build a whole gigafactory. So you're talking 10, 20 years to get a mine permitted in this country. So that has to get speeded up. The other thing we're pushing, particularly with the South Americans, is do your upgrading there. Don't just give the ore to the Chinese or whoever else. Make more of the money in your own country and process it to a lithium carbonate, a lithium hydroxide, or to a nickel sulfate right there. But no, we should be ashamed of ourselves in many ways. This country is a hotbed of battery activities. We probably have more folks doing basic science. Since all the IP of the chemistry used is American, a bit of it's British. But Asia doesn't have too much of that. Every material that has been invented really has been invented here. We have thousands of startups pushing the frontiers, but this is this exponential hype, and that does not help the field. So if somebody invests in the company, then it goes belly up, that hurts everybody. There's a huge gap in prototyping batteries and in battery equipment used to make batteries. This is changing, and I'll show you a few examples of how we've got involved. And probably most of you heard the announcements maybe 2 weeks ago of these billions of dollars going into the battery supply chain, including Applied Materials just down the road. I think they got more than $1 million. So this is the situation today, perhaps more accurately to say yesterday. All the IP, this initial testing is done in this country. If you want to make, say, 1,000 cells for prototyping, then all your IP goes to Asia. Then those cells come back to the US in the final product. We cannot do the prototyping and commercial cell operations in this country. So what we have planned, we've described what we call Battery New York. This will be a pilot facility that can make full-size scales, can make somewhere between 30 and 40 megawatt hours of cells a year, both on the pouch line and cylindrical line. It will also allow equipment manufacturers to test out their equipment. So right now, no one's going to take the risk of buying a new piece of equipment if they don't know how well it works. And some of the things we're trying to do is eliminate some of these noxious chemicals, like NMP, which we use for making the coatings, and use some polymerization type technique. Our hope is then this will lead to commercial manufacturing. Clearly, we wanted in New York initially, but then spread all over North America. And as I said, we have 1 gigafactory in Binghamton right now. There's another one of a Canadian company opening up in Western New York. So what our project will do, it has 5 components. We'll have this facility, and probably most of you don't know what Binghamton's known for. It was the largest shoe factory, Endicott Johnson, for maybe 50 to 80 years. And then that all went overseas. All the aircraft, practicing for the pilots, all that came out of Binghamton. And if you go to Binghamton, there's a little museum there where you can sit in these machines and see how they look like. And these were the first big market was to the Royal Air Force in England in about 1939. And then IBM started up in Binghamton. So IBM's original facilities were in Binghamton, and they left maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe 10,000 people left when they got out of manufacturing. So it's those facilities that we are going to use some of their buildings, and that's where the New York Battery Center will go to. We have round about $113 million. This was from a EDA proposal, part of this Build Back Better regional challenge. We won that, and the state threw in an additional $15 million if we got it. So we'll have that battery facility, we'll have a big supply chain effort, and the biggest thing we found, and I know talking to folks here, we don't have workers in this country who know this area. So there'll be a huge effort, I think about $12 million to set up a workforce training program. Endicott, where IBM was, is a very depressed community, so there'll be a goal to actually get that community back. And the IM3 New York facility, most of their floor workers are now from that local town, so they can in fact walk to work. Then we got to have a number of startup companies, which is the acceleration part of it. And this formally had its kickoff 10 days ago, and that's the Undersecretary for EDA, which is part of the government, and we were showing her around the battery plant, which is starting to make batteries there right now. She came across as extremely smart and knew what she was doing. Been in, I think, 4 or 5 administrations. I think you all recognize the fellow on the right-hand side. I think this was his 3rd trip to our university in the last 3 months. He's up for re-election, so he clearly wants to say, look, Look how much money I brought to Binghamton. But no, so we've gone from basic research, we still do some basic research, but we feel our challenge today is to correct what happened when Exxon did this and all that technology went overseas, and to bring it back to America. So I will stop there, and if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Us to go to all electric vehicles, which is going to require a larger capacity of electricity generation in the country. And how are we going to get that capacity increased without burning fossil fuels?
We're going to have more wind and solar, and you saw that facility down in Moss Landing. I am told that facility is nowhere near big enough. You make more solar energy in the middle of the day in this region than they can store. So solar energy is worth almost nothing in the middle of the day. So if we can use that, plus if you go up north, Washington State, New York, Quebec, Ontario, huge amounts of hydropower we can use day or night. And I think there's going to be probably more control over how much power you use at certain times of the day. So you can have smart meters, which probably tell you, don't charge your car up at 5 o'clock when everybody's cooking dinner. Wait a bit later and charge it up in the middle of the night. And there's going to be, I think, if you look at large charging facilities, say on the interstates, you'll probably have a 5 to 10 megawatt hour storage facility at that interstate, so it can be charged up at when electricity is low cost and readily available, and then you use it at other times of the day. So I think, no. The big issue we have to do, the grid has to be modernized. And this is the bit of the act that was recently passed for Congress that didn't get through. So everybody blamed Manchin because there's some coal stuff in there, but there's a huge amount of stuff in there for modernizing the electricity grid for solar power and wind power. And that basically got knocked out at that stage.
Short question. How do you come up with great ideas?
If I knew, I'd have many more, right? You have to do things logically, and as I tell my students now, don't try everything. Think through your experiment very carefully and plan what you're going to do. But also something else, I don't believe in large groups with lots of technicians. I believe in the old Bell Labs model. The scientist needs to be on the bench. They can then observe what is happening and take advantage. What do we call it? The mistakes, the things that shouldn't happen? No. Most of you know how Teflon was discovered. They lost the pressure in the tank, and somebody said, what's going on? And you have to look at what doesn't work. And John Goodenough had the same thing with lithium iron phosphate. He wasn't trying to make that, but this phase kept coming up.
I'm Paul Denig. So 2 questions. First, in order to make enough of lithium-ion batteries for the EV evolution, we have to probably recycle everything that has been made. And right now, it's cost prohibitive. And there are some companies trying to make inroads, Kinspersky Brothers, Redwood Materials, and so on, but I don't know how they're doing. The second is you didn't spend a lot of time on solid electrolytes. I'm wondering how that progress is going.
On the first part, the largest recycling effort today in the United States is Lithium Cycle, which is a Toronto company. Their US headquarters are in Rochester, New York. So they have this hub and spoke business model where they're going to collect the batteries and then turn them into what they call black mass, ship them to New York, then convert them into the original metals so you can use them in the batteries. And they claim they're profitable today. If you're getting a lot of cobalt in the cells, there's huge value in that cobalt. The issue will be if we go to cells with lithium iron phosphate, iron's worth nothing, the phosphorus is worth nothing. Maybe the copper current collectors are worth something, so it'll be much more challenging. So the more we get the cost of the batteries down, it's going to be more challenging to recycle. And I don't know what the law is in California. In New York, it's illegal to throw out any batteries into the garbage. And they've had a number of examples. One was just 3 years ago, a recycling plant had plastics in it, and it caught fire one night, and they think what happened, they'd crushed the plastics, and somebody had thrown a cell phone in with their plastics. And that shorted out the battery, and the whole facility went up in flames. My suspicion is California has similar laws. You cannot throw used batteries and devices into the garbage. So they need to be recycled. And what was the second part of your question? There's a lot of effort on solid-state electrolytes. I have to be a little careful because I'm an advisor to one of those companies. Solid-state electrolytes are some years off, and I think there's a tendency now in the field not to talk about solid-state batteries, but talk about hybrid batteries. So you'll have a solid-state electrolyte in there. The cathode side will still have a few drops of liquid in the cathode. Otherwise, the ions can't easily get from particle to particle. So if you're ever talking to somebody who claims to have a solid-state battery, ask them how many drops of liquid you add to it. Don't ask them whether it has any liquid, but how many drops do you add. And I think there's issues with several of the ideas that we've clearly seen in the business area that these polyethylene oxides, the polymer solid electrolytes, they're prone to catch fire. So one of those Mercedes buses I showed you caught fire in Stuttgart almost exactly a year ago. When being recharged at night, it burnt down the facility plus 25 other buses. And earlier this year, 2 buses using the same batteries made by a different manufacturer caught fire whilst in Paris with passengers on them. Everybody got out. So people are a little worried about these polymeric solid state. Some of the ceramic, I think, separators should be much safer, but we won't know until we can really test them and see what can go wrong. I have concerns about what we call the sulfide separators. How stable are they? And will they generate H2S and SO2 and other things if they catch fire? But they're 5 to 10 years out. You probably see them in your watches and phones before you see them in large-scale devices.
Hi. You spoke a lot about batteries for cars, and I'm wondering if you think that lithium-ion batteries will be able to play a role in electrifying other high CO2 emitting transportation, such as airliners and cargo ships.
Yes and no. So the large 16-wheelers, I showed you one truck there, those are all short haul. If you want long haul, you have to carry more batteries than you can carry cargo. It doesn't make sense. So I think if you have your big 16-wheelers, you want them to go from California to New York, they're probably going to be fuel cell powered with a very large battery. Because remember, a fuel cell only operates at constant output. It doesn't like to accelerate. It can't do regenerative braking. So you may find you'll have fuel cell storage stations with hydrogen at the rest stops on all the interstates. But they'll basically use fuel cells. And there are already some buses that have taken out the diesel engine, put a fuel cell in with the same batteries. There's interest in short haul aircraft with electrification. Particularly, there's a company in Seattle, so you can fly from, say, Seattle to all the little islands, and maybe without anybody on board. And maybe the biggest thing will be for emergency rescue, where you can send a small electric aircraft out, whether it's a regular type or the hover type, and it can take medicine and actually search for people in the, let's say in the mountains. Crazy people who go climbing mountains when it's 100 degrees and then they collapse or something. But there's interest there. Shipping, I'm not sure. No, small boats, clearly they're being electrified. Some tugboats are electrified. In Scandinavia, the ferry boats are electrified now. And I expect if you want to have a boat on any of very clean lakes in the west here, they're all going to be eventually electrified. But your large ocean liners, I don't see it happening.
Aye.
I really enjoyed the historical overview as well. And now for closing remarks, the man of the day, Bill Nix, introduced by Wally Rhines.
So we're here today to honor Professor William D. Nix, or if you go by the name on his birth certificate, it's Billy D. Nix, spelled B-I-L-L-I-E, something that he tries to avoid people finding out about. But he has so many honors, I think it would be impossible for me to introduce him and go through very much of it. So I refer to you his autobiography, Living an American Dream, where he tells this in great detail. He doesn't say in there that he was the most popular professor in the history of our department, but I think that's certainly been true. But he's a man of many firsts. He was the first metallurgical engineering graduate of San Jose State University. He was really the first graduate student in what we think of today as our material science and engineering department. And if I'm to believe his biography, he was the first graduate student to be accepted to graduate school with such a miserable grade point average as an undergrad. Now, I was introduced to him, I, like many of you, took the Introduction to Engineering Materials, and we used Barrett, Tettleman, and Nix. It was in mimeographed form at that time, and I took it from Craig Barrett. And he also had another book, Imperfections in Crystalline Solids, with Wei Kai. And he concentrated a lot of his research in dislocations and mechanical properties, but in fact, it was much broader than that. His thesis dealt with magnetic domains and their motion in ferroelectric materials. His work, surprisingly, overlapped with what Stan Whittingham talked about, working on silicon electrodes for lithium-ion batteries, and actually had two graduate students who pursued this. And in fact, he had many other things in common with Stan. As already mentioned, he took over the Center for Materials Research and became Stan's supervisor. But they both chose Bob Huggins as their supervisor. Bill's original supervisor at Stanford was, in fact, Bob Huggins, and of course the supervisor for Stan was as well. Now, Bill has had almost, I think actually, every possible academic position you can have in the Department of Material Science and Engineering. He's had every type of level of professorship. He was head of the Center for Materials Research. He was the assistant chair of the department. He was chair of the department. And he's the only one, of course, who's written a history of our department, something you can see out there. The other thing that he did, after he retired, he tells me he continued to do everything he was doing before he retired. Research, working with students, teaching classes. And so when I look at the book and he says that he achieved great wealth as a result of his satisfaction in what he had done and the students he had worked with, but he didn't achieve monetary wealth. And so I have to wonder how he negotiated a position to do the same thing without pay as before. Maybe he was a little short on the negotiating skills. Anyway, he's gotten virtually every honor you can receive as a material science and engineering expert. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering. He's a fellow of the American Association of Arts and Sciences. He's a fellow of the ASM. He's a fellow of TMS, fellow of the Materials Research Association. And if you look at the various teaching awards, research awards, and the distinguished lectureships, he's given almost all of them. But I think the greatest honor came in 2020 when he was awarded the William D. Nix Award, the William D. Nix Medal, which was created and funded by his former students. There are 80 of those students, or thereabouts, and they are his primary legacy that goes forward and that will cause him to be remembered for many years ahead. So today, I give you someone who is still living the American dream, Professor William D. Nix.
Thanks, Wally, for an entertaining but warm and gracious introduction. I couldn't have done it better. You even got the Billy with the IE. That's a story that I tell in the memoir that. This has been really a wonderful occasion, and I'm really pleased that the department could get together in this way. And I'm happy if they can use my name to bring you all together for this kind of an occasion. And I think the plan is that each year we would have something of this sort. So thank you all for coming and being a part of. Well, many of you being a part of, most of you being a part of my life, but also here for this department celebration. Well, thanks to Alberto mainly and the MSc faculty for getting the idea to put this together and to have this occasion. And the thought was that we would, in fact, bring a lot of our colleagues together and celebrate each year, celebrate what the department has meant to so many of us. So thank you, Alberto, and all the other faculty that are involved. And I should also thank Fee and Vincent for organizing this particular event and keeping everyone on track. So where I can't see you, if Fee is here and Vincent is out there. Thank you guys and your staff, the MSc staff, for putting this all together. This is great fun for me, obviously, but I'm sure from the smiles on your faces, I think it's great fun for you all as well. Now, it's really wonderful to see how diverse material science has become, as exemplified by the talks by Kunal and Sarah today. All kinds of new directions have developed that has really enriched the department way above what it was in my time. And it's a particular honor for me personally and for the department, for Stan, to come and give the inaugural lecture. So thank you, Stan. As he's already mentioned, Stan and I were together with Bob Huggins 50 years ago, about 50 years ago, a little more than 50 years ago. And as he has been mentioned a couple of times here, it turns out soon after he came, as I'm repeating what you've already heard, but soon after he came, Bob Huggins went off to Washington to run the ARPA program, the Materials Research Program in Washington. And so he was gone for 2 years. And Stan tells that I was Stan's supervisor. So Stan would come in periodically, not very often, and tell me what he and the students that he was guiding were doing, and I would simply say, carry on, carry on. That was the best advice I ever gave anyone, as you can now plainly see. Now, as you know, if you've read, and it's around here, A Century of Material Science and Engineering at Stanford. Some of you have it there. You know, by looking through that, and maybe some of the things you've heard, I've been here a long time. Now, well, not a century, of course, but still a very long time. This quarter, fall 2022, marks the 60 years that I've been here in the faculty, doing whatever I could. Started teaching full-time in 1962 in the fall. So this is now 60 years exactly. So that's when I started. But I was aiming to be a teacher really long before that. Let me tell you where this came from. My mother always said she wanted me to be a teacher. Now it's likely because in her hometown in the northwestern corner of Arkansas, it was a small little town called Berryville, and I think, she didn't say this, but I think she regarded the teacher as the key person in the community, and she wanted her son to be a teacher. And she always said that. When I was very small, he'd be a teacher. Well, I didn't pay much attention to that, thinking, well, that's whatever. That's what mothers do, right? But in college at San Jose State, and I'll correct something that Wally mentioned. He said San Jose State University. Not quite right. It was San Jose State College at the time, not a university yet. It's now a Stanford. Okay, small correction. But anyway, at San Jose State College, as a student there, I sort of liked to help other people do their assignments, and we would gather together in the library on Saturdays, and I would help them with their homework. And it occurs to me that my writing on yellow tablets that some of you would know about might have started there, although they weren't yellow, as I recall. But I would help folks around and show them how to do things, and that's where my interest in teaching developed there. Well, so I realized, because I was pretty ignorant in many ways, but I realized that, well, you probably needed to try to get a PhD to really pursue this. And so, as was mentioned there, I joined the metallurgical engineering department in January of 1959. That was the forerunner, of course, of the material science department. And as you've read in the history, of course, it had origins way back from the mining and metallurgy department that Theodore Hoover started in 1919, the founding head of our department, as I wrote about in that book. Now, when I joined, there was a faculty of 5. Alberto mentioned 8. Well, earlier there was faculty of 5, but that was up from 2 the previous year. So we were pretty small potatoes at that time. So I was really lucky, and also I think Stan might have mentioned Sputnik. I was lucky because right at that time, that was just when I came. It was just 2 years after Sputnik 1, October 4, 1957. I remember it well. We used to look it up there and see it going overhead, actually, see the reflections of it. And that, as people had their hair on fire about what are we going to do about this, and so there was a tremendous effort all over the world, particularly in the U.S., to try to respond to this, and science and technology then was king, and that then led Stanford and many other places to really up their game in materials broadly. So that's what sort of got me going, and once I came to the department, I continued developing an interest in teaching, and but I was appointed they really needed people. There weren't very many people. How about you? So that's how I never interviewed for a job, by the way. Think about that. I never interviewed for a job. They say, well, would you do this? Yeah, okay, I'll do that. So in the fall of '62, I accepted an appointment as an acting assistant professor. Acting because I hadn't finished my degree yet, and the tradition is, well, you got to wait till your degree's finished, and then you get the permanent appointment. So my official start was in '63, but I claim it was '62 because I was full-time teaching in 1962. It's kind of interesting to think about. Among the current active faculty in the department, only Bob Sinclair and Rainer Dausgaard were even alive then. Yeah, think about that. And Rainer was only 3. Where's Rainer? Yeah. Another thing I will mention here, so I joined the faculty and it transformed into a regular appointment. Let's see, I was actually granted tenure. So this is '62. My formal appointment started in '63. By late '65, like in December of '65, this is just over 2 years, the decision was already taken I would be granted tenure. Holy smokes. I had done almost nothing. But it just shows you how different, how times have changed. This is inside baseball here, but at the time that I was appointed to a tenured faculty member, not just appointed to the faculty, appointed to tenure, I had an H index of 1. Now, those of you who are laughing know what that means. What that means is I had but one paper that was cited once. That was it. That was the whole story. Yeah. So how times have changed. We do things. The record I had at the time I received tenure, I wouldn't have been given the time of day, even applying for a faculty position at the most junior level. But anyway, so times have changed. Now what I've done I won't go on too long here. If you're saying, how long is he going to go on? What I've done mostly is in the intervening, I could say years, but I should say decades, is really done by my academic family. I call it my academic, my students and the people that I've worked with and so on. Many of whom, we had an open house yesterday, about 60 people there at our house, and many of my former students were there, and some of you who are here were there. And I'm really indebted to all of the students who did the things for which I get credit. I've said that many times. And in recognition to receive my appreciation, maybe I could get all of my students, former students, to stand and stay standing, please, right now. There's some here, I know. Please, keep standing. And could stay standing. We're not, I'm not done yet. Yeah, exactly. And then would others who were postdocs, visiting scholars, visitors, professors, visiting professors, or anyone with whom I've published, say, add to there you go. Here we go. So thank you all for, as I've said many times, I get all the credit for what you folks have done. So thank you very much for that. my students one time arranged for me to get a mentoring award from Sigma Psi. And it wasn't for anything that I've done, but it was for work, whatever mentoring I've done. So, you know, naturally I was supposed to come there and give a lecture, which I did. And the lecture I gave was one in which I kind of went through virtually all of my students and recounted what they had actually accomplished and why they were well known now. And it turns out that virtually all of them did what they did after they left me. So you can see how, you know, a remarkable story. Each and every one, well, no, they did that after they left me, not with me. So very few of the things that they did with me is their most important achievement. So that's some measure, I guess, of mentoring. You never know how you do this. Okay. So let's see. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that all of you stood. Thank you very much. And I was disinclined to try to name them. Now, in part because at the dinner where I received my chair, a couple of my students were there, and I got a little nervous when I was accepting the chair, and I called Tim Kevin and Kevin Tim, and I never heard the last of that. So I was very much disinclined to try to go around here and name everyone. So, however, of course I can't name everyone here, but I will mention Bill Coughlin he's the most senior of my students, and he was my 6th PhD student in 1969. So Bill, stand up. And then also Bob Johnson. Where's Bob? Bob Johnson is right there. He was my 8th student, standing in also 1969. So that was the start. And then, let's see, is Lucas Burla here? He was here at the thing. There he is, Lucas. He's already standing. Lucas was my 79th student in 2014, if I have it right. Lucas, he'll correct me, as he always did. Okay. Well, but mostly, and I'm almost finished, but mostly I'm indebted to my family. Our daughter Cynthia, who carries on at Stanford as a senior director in information technology. And our son Jeff, who is a director of software engineering at Salesforce in San Francisco, and also, I should add, an active musician, and his wife, Catherine, and our younger daughter, Becky, who maintains the math traditions in the family as an actuary, and her husband, Mark. Now, they were all there yesterday putting on, for many of you, this open house. So I'm very appreciative, of the tolerance that they had for me for so many decades, but also especially for the event that they put on for all of us and so many of you. And finally, my deepest thanks to my wife, Jean. Many of you know, I call her Jeannie. I'm not sure quite where that came from. She has been looking after me for all of our 64 years of marriage, and even longer, actually. Some of you know, I've told this story before, some of you know that our first date was in 1949, 73 years ago. Holy smokes. And one of the things I add here, and I really believe it, as a 12-year-old, I had great judgment. I could not have been minded by a more caring and loving person, and I should add, among the wisest and smartest people I have known. Qualities that come in very handy in taking care of the likes of me for so long. So thank you all for your coming to this and this event.
Thank you, Bill. Well, now that I learned that you taught before being appointed, maybe I can ask you to come back. We're a little short in the winter. You can teach a class for us in the winter. Well, thank you, Bill. Well, this closes the presentations part of the day, but the day is in no way over. Just remember, we have posters from our students if you want to learn all the great research that's going on in the department. And before you join us for lunch, I want to extend thanks again to our staff for organizing this great event, all the speakers today and all the people who presented the speakers today, and more important, all of you who accepted our invitation and joined us here today. You're a great support for our department, and it's great that you express the support by coming in person. So thank you, everyone, and I'm looking forward to meeting as many of you as possible over lunch and the rest of the afternoon, and also hearing all the serendipitous conversations that will occur as you reconnect after years. Thank you, everyone.